Hello, I am Pastor Dwight here at Pleasant Hill Baptist Church in Sterling, Ohio. Thank you for connecting with us on our website today. If you have already listened to Pastor Mark's introduction to this video series, I would imagine that one of the reasons you're continuing to listen is because, like me, you have an interest in this topic. We have experienced the feeling, the sensation, that at times God has possibly deserted us. At least it seems that God isn't very near sometimes. And within these days in which we live, possibly because of the COVID-19 pandemic and all of its accompanying consequences, or possibly because of some other very serious and somber and grievous situation in our lives, which continue to chronically exist with no end in sight, it's easy for us to voice, if not out loud, then in our mind, where are you, God? What are you doing? How long are you going to let me suffer as I am? And I assure you that you're not alone with such thoughts. We're all human. People are people. Life contains unpleasant experiences at times, to say the least. And it doesn't matter as to the country in which we may live, or the time, or the century in which we may live. People share in common experiences. And also then in the deeply felt questions that those experiences produce. I assure you that we're going to look at what God communicates to us as we seek to find an answer to our questions. And so I direct your attention to a man named David out of the Old Testament, and particularly in the book of Psalms and chapter 13. In this session, as well as in the next session, it will be helpful for you to see and then to understand what David wrote in this chapter. So I certainly invite you, if you have a Bible available, to turn to Psalm 13. I'm going to read all 6 verses of this chapter, but we're only going to consider some of them in this session, and then we'll conclude it or finish it in the next session. Psalm 13. How long will you forget me, O Lord, forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and hear me, O Lord my God. Lighten mine eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Lest my enemies say, I have prevailed against him, and those that trouble me rejoice when I am moved. But I have trusted in thy mercy. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing unto the Lord, because he has dealt bountifully with me. Those are the 6 verses there in Psalm chapter 13. Now, from verses 1 to 4, we can clearly see that David was living in the midst of some very dark and gloomy circumstances. It was as if he was living in a tunnel of darkness. But he had difficulty coping with it because he couldn't see any light at the end of the tunnel. He couldn't see where life was leading him. And we may think the same at times. You may be thinking the same thing today. I want to assure you, though, that there is always hope. The Old Testament prophet Isaiah described David in this kind of situation in Isaiah chapter 50 and verse 10, when he wrote this, who walks in darkness and has no light. But I want you to listen to the rest of what he wrote in verse 10 when we read, let him trust in the name of the Lord and stay dependent upon his God. When we are grieved and when we are hurting, even chronically, we all seem to ask 2 main questions. The first question is, why? Why has this happened to me? Why here? Why now? The second question, in addition to why, is how? How long? This question is actually repeated 4 times by David in verses 1 and 2 in this chapter. How long will you forget me? Forever? How long will you hide your face from me and do nothing? How long will you be silent, causing me to sorrowfully listen to my own thoughts? How long will you allow my enemy be exalted while I am being humiliated and belittled? Now, David obviously had a sense of despair, but we must notice here that David's questions are actually a diagnosis of his problem. He had begun to identify the causes of his discouragement, and he saw that it had to do with his relationship with God. The 4 questions David asked are actually not 4 different questions, but 4 facets of the same question. Namely, why do I feel that God has deserted me? So it is within this question that we can see what the problems are. The first problem is that we have assumed that God has forgotten us, that God has absented himself from us. And as a result, we can begin to feel that nobody cares. We can begin to feel that we don't count for anything, that we're worthless, that we've never accomplished anything worthwhile. But along with this sense of being forgotten, David also assumed that God was hiding his face from him. Now, we know forgetfulness may be accidental, but hiding is a deliberate act of avoidance. David had assumed that this is what God was doing. The second problem is that if God is hiding his face from us, then we don't know where he is looking and we don't know what he is planning. The point is that David had lost all sense of what God was doing. He had no clues regarding what God was planning to do in his life. And worse than not seeing any light at the end of the tunnel was that he didn't know if there was an end to that tunnel. And so if you're like David, you need to spend some time thinking about what Isaiah wrote in Isaiah 49:15, when he wrote this: "Can a woman forget her nursing child, that she would have no compassion on the son of her womb? Yes, she may forget." Now listen, the rest of it says, "Yet I, God, will not forget you." Now, sure, there are experiences in life that seem to go on forever. Certain sorrows, certain burdens, certain disappointments, maybe a little more specifically, the loss of a great job, maybe a broken romance, the seemingly irreversible situation that can not be resolved. And each day, that deep sorrow shadows everything that we do. But here's the truth. God has not forgotten you. In verse 2, David wondered how long he could take counsel in his soul. Those are the words that he uses there. And that's an intriguing statement. The word counsel has the idea of the activity of our minds. And the word soul it refers to the seat of our emotions. Our mind, our emotions. They don't naturally go together. We don't think with our feelings. At least we shouldn't. We should think, and we do think with our minds. Otherwise, we're going to confuse ourselves. And that was the problem here with David. You see, when we attempt to think and reason on the basis of our feelings, we can become distressed and we can become disoriented and discouraged. The point is that we should never, ever let our feelings do our thinking, because our feelings will lead us astray. This was the problem that, for example, that Eve had in the Garden of Eden back in the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. We read there that the temptation that she was confronted with appealed to her emotions and her inner desires. She thought with her feelings. Later on in the Old Testament, we come to David himself again, and it was the same for David when he sinned with Bathsheba. He fought with his feelings. And so our sorrows and our trials and disappointments can confuse our correct and righteous thinking through our feelings. Now, without even realizing it, David was having a spiritual breakthrough here in Psalm 13, because what the chapter is actually a prayer. He is talking to God. And as he did so, he was identifying the problem of thinking with his feelings instead of what God has communicated in his written word. And as we move from verse 2 to verse 3, as a result of talking to God about the questions he had, there is the underlying understanding that God does hear and God does care. And that's true for us too. We have to stop right now, but in the next session we will pick up with verse 3 and the prayerful exhortations that David presented to God. I hope that you will please join me again.